Thank you, Ceann Comhairle, and thank you for your contribution, Minister. And we've spoken about this bill before, and I'm just reflecting on your comments actually earlier today about the nature of government intervention and universality, just in reference to free GP care. It is something that I would agree with you with. The government, which has been referenced by previous speakers, actually did bring in free GP care for children on the basis of universality, on the understanding that a member of a society who pays their taxes into that society should feel that everybody should benefit from that society, regardless of their background, regardless of their income. It allows everybody to feel as if there isn't this myth of a squeezed middle, or a myth of those who benefit solely, and those who have this famous tax burden. And that's why I agree with you, Taoiseach, when your references earlier about the nature of universality. And that's why I feel that the government really should move towards, and this is really linked to what we're talking about, and when we speak about the cost of living, there are things, as my colleague Ivana Batrick said earlier, and we constantly say in the Labour Party that are expenses in Ireland that aren't expenses anywhere else in Europe, or your average European citizen, if they were to relocate here, would find to be quite unusual. And GP care is one of them. GP visits is one of them. In fact, you're from the north and you relocate to the south, you'd find you'd have to get used to the idea that you have to put your hand in your pocket for a GP visit, and other things such as school books, etc. So that ambition from government to move from what was achieved in the government, which was referenced earlier, of free GP care for children, moving to a universal system, is something that will go in tandem with this as time moves on. And you'll know, Minister, as well, that it was the Labour Party that, at the beginning of the pandemic, I believe in September of 2020, put forward a private member's bill from Senator Marie Sherlock, in recognising that this was a major gap in our legislation. At the start of a pandemic, we didn't have a statutory sick pay scheme. And in fairness to you, Taoiseach, you did acknowledge that at the time. You said you prioritise it, and sure enough, here we are. True to your word, you have produced the goods. Produced a bill that we obviously are going to have issues with and will want to improve. And again, ICTU have also paid tribute to the collaborative nature of the process. So this is an improved bill, but as others have said, it certainly has a way to go. It is unfortunate, it does appear the government is ignoring some of the very clear recommendations on a cross-party basis made by the Oireachtas Committee on Enterprise Employment, on certified sick leave, and the enormous issues low and middle wage workers will face paying for and accessing timely GP services. And again, Ceann Comhairle, I would remind the House, again referring back to discussion held earlier, that in Ireland we do have a disproportionately low pay economy. From OECD, on OECD's statistic, 23% of Irish workers are statistically in low pay. In fact, for younger workers, about 40% of workers under 30 are in insecure work. Now, if you're in insecure work, it leads to insecure accommodation, it leads to all sorts of other insecurities, and health insecurity will be another one. And that's why the right to statutory sick pay for those workers is so essential. So the reality is that a low-paid worker could end up paying more to a GP than what they will get back in terms of 70% of daily pay for being out sick. For a minimum wage worker, that will be a certain reality. The government is failing to protect and look after minimum wage workers, and that's why, Taoiseach, while I appreciate you have to balance the frustrations or the concerns that an employer would have, we would feel, certainly in the Labour Party, that it's the most vulnerable person in this transaction would be that low-pay worker who doesn't really ever feel as if they have enough power to make the case, and that's why we are here to make the case for them. This legislation, unfortunately, still is a far cry from what the Labour Party did propose in September 2020 on foot of appeals by workers' representatives of meat plant workers and early year workers in SIPTU and ICTU, who were asking to provide a sick pay scheme for all. It does not represent a right to access sick pay from the start of employment. Seasonal workers, early years educators such as early childhood care and education workers and others who are employed for a part of the year will be forced to start 13 weeks before they are entitled to this paid sick leave. So ECCE work is typically employed on 38-week contracts, and so every September, every worker must wait 13 weeks before they can get paid sick leave. And that is not right. It's not fair. It's also, as has been referenced, been outlined as a major flaw within the bill by Patricia King and others within ICTU, such as Laura Bambrick, and are asking that the word continuous be omitted from the bill. And I'm quite sure Taoiseach, at later stages as we pass through this legislation, we can work on that in a collaborative fashion. The bill fails to ensure that workers will not be out of pocket. The Joint Oireachtas Committee on Enterprise, Trade and Employment recommended that a minimum rate of pay be introduced, and from the government statement last week it's not clear that it will be there. Serious questions remain over the government's reluctance to hardwire into the bill the provision of 10 days sick leave that is due to be paid in 2025. There are real concerns that the 3 days that the government will make available from this year will remain at the mercy of ministerial regulation, and that is not acceptable. So, in conclusion, Ken Corla, I think sometimes in this Oireachtas we do our best to be as uncooperative as possible. We pretend, we play the panto villain role often, and that's not a fair reflection of what genuinely happens in these houses. The Labour Party made a recommendation to government in September of 2020. The government recognised that it needed to be done and are now bringing forward legislation. It is unfortunate that the pandemic appears to a large degree to be over before we're at the stage now of introducing the bill. But having said that, with goodwill, we are now at the stage where we can actually hopefully bring it into law. And I noted the Taoiseach's determination to work with opposition parties to ensure that we could have this in place by the middle of the year. I think that's the phrase that the Taoiseach used. That kind of energy, I think, probably needed to be there from September of 2020, because then we could have had much more workers availing of a sick leave provision as they worked their way through the pandemic. So the points as I've made in relation to the word continuous, in relation to the low-pay workers remain. But the point I began with, Taoiseach, is the point I'll finish with. The things in Ireland that are unusual, that do add to the current debate on cost of living, and the fact that in most European countries, and certainly in these islands, that to pay for a GP visit is considered to be the role of the state to protect its citizens in that regard, and to pay for an individual, to even have to consider the cost of such a visit, regardless of your income, is something that people in the north would never do, something that people in Britain would never do. And I think that's the kind of lesson we have to take from this pandemic. So while this piece of legislation can be improved, but while we welcome the fact that it's here to be discussed, and I will certainly work with you on that, it is one part of a wider discussion about how we deal with sickness, how we deal with healthcare, what the state provides. Because as the Labour Party will always argue for, we need a bigger state, we need more rights, and we need to have basic provisions in Ireland that are available in other jurisdictions, and it changes the way that people interact with their employer and indeed interact with the state. And again, to agree with you, Taoiseach, on the ethic and the principle of universality, we agree with that as well. So, Taoiseach, myself, the Labour Party, Senator Marie Sherlock, who proposed the bill in September 2020, I think that that's what kick-started this debate in these houses. Again, to thank you for taking on the legislation and bringing it to this point, but we do want to improve it, so the balance is there for the worker who is vulnerable, and not always for the employer who is trying to pick holes in the rights that his or her employee will have. Thank